announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
In a world where global powers constantly test each other's resolve, one unprecedented event has set the stage for what could be the most dangerous naval confrontation in decades. The target? The USS Gerald R. Ford, the most powerful warship ever built, carrying 5,000 American sailors, 75 aircraft, and 100,000 tons of military might. The location? The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage that sees 1/5 of the world's oil supply pass through it every day. The unthinkable. A ballistic missile fired directly at this American colossus. On a fateful day, while transiting through this vital maritime corridor, the Gerald R. Ford found itself in the crosshairs of a missile launched by Iran. A missile designed to test the limits of American power and the will to defend it. But the real danger didn't lie in the missile itself. It was the terrifying chain reaction that followed. In under 4 minutes, the missile was intercepted, but that's where the situation spiraled into chaos. What happened next wasn't just a show of military might. It was a full-scale activation of Iran's coastal defense network. Fast attack boats surged from the port of Bandar Abbas, and submarines began to move into position, ready to strike. As the tension escalated, the world's most critical oil choke point, this tiny stretch of water that feeds the global economy, became a potential war zone. The Strait of Hormuz was now a flashpoint, where any misstep could lead to a catastrophic escalation. With the missile threat neutralized, the situation on the ground worsened. Carrier strike groups from the United States began to converge on the area. Stealth bombers, including B-2s, repositioned, ready to carry out operations. Cyber attacks, unseen but highly disruptive, began to target vital systems. Oil prices spiked, and nations around the world watched with bated breath. Was this posturing? Or had Iran truly crossed a line no nation has dared to since the end of World War II? In this video, we dive deep into the events of that fateful day, the missile launch, the global ramifications, and the hidden strategy behind Iran's actions. What could have driven them to target the most powerful warship in the world? What are the strategic moves behind this bold and risky decision? And most importantly, where does this conflict go from here? As carrier strike groups circle the Persian Gulf, B-2 bombers prepare for potential airstrikes, and tensions rise across the region, one thing is certain. This is far more than a single missile attack. The stakes have never been higher, and the world watches as a volatile situation threatens to spiral out of control. Stay tuned, because what happens next could change the course of history. In the early hours of a seemingly ordinary day, the world's focus shifted dramatically to the heart of the Persian Gulf, where a single decision could tip the balance of power in one of the world's most strategically volatile regions. The USS Gerald R. Ford, a marvel of modern engineering and military prowess, was on a routine mission in the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point where 20% of the world's oil passes through daily. With 5,000 American sailors on board and 75 fighter jets ready to launch at a moment's notice, the Gerald R. Ford wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of American naval dominance, a floating fortress that embodied decades of military development and technological innovation. Yet this symbol of power became the focus of a bold, aggressive act that could not have been anticipated. A ballistic missile fired from Iranian territory, aimed directly at the heart of the most powerful warship ever constructed. What led to this extraordinary moment? On the surface, it was a direct confrontation between the United States and Iran, two nations with a history of tension and distrust. But beneath the surface, a far deeper game was being played, one that involved not just the military might of both nations, but the geopolitical stability of the entire Middle East. For months leading up to this event, tensions had been simmering. Iran had been increasingly vocal about its opposition to the American military presence in the region, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow and vital waterway that Iran considered its own. In response to U.S. naval maneuvers near Iranian territorial waters, Tehran had been conducting its own series of military drills, showcasing a growing capability in missile technology, drone warfare, and naval tactics. The missile launch itself came as a shock, not because the possibility of aggression from Iran was unforeseeable, but because of the sheer audacity and precision of the attack. The missile, believed to be an advanced Shahab-4, a medium-range ballistic missile capable of carrying a conventional warhead, was fired with pinpoint accuracy toward the Gerald R. Ford as it sailed through the strait. It was a missile designed not only to challenge the might of the U.S. Navy, but to test the resolve of America's military defenses. For Iran, this attack was more than just a military strike. It was a message. In Iran's eyes, the presence of the Gerald R. Ford in the region represented an ongoing U.S. dominance that threatened Iran's sovereignty. This missile launch, then, was the culmination of months of rising tensions and political posturing. A bold declaration that Iran would no longer stand idly by as its neighbors and adversaries used the Strait of Hormuz as a staging ground for military power. The American response, however, was swift and decisive. Within 4 minutes, the Gerald R. Ford's Advanced Missile Defense System, the Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense System, engaged the incoming threat, launching an interceptor missile that shattered the trajectory of the Iranian projectile. The missile exploded in the air, well short of its target, sending a shockwave through the crew on deck. While the missile strike itself was thwarted, the message sent by Iran was far from lost on the American military. In those fleeting moments, as the USS Gerald R. Ford survived the attack, a new chapter in the volatile history of the Middle East was beginning to unfold. It wasn't just the loss of a missile that was the issue. It was the escalation that followed. Almost immediately after the failed missile attack, Iran activated its full coastal defense network, turning the region into a military tinderbox. Fast attack boats surged from Bandar Abbas, darting through the waters in a show of force, while Iranian submarines, some of them possibly equipped with nuclear-capable cruise missiles, moved into position beneath the waves, ready to strike. Iran's sophisticated radar systems, coupled with an array of anti-ship missiles, ensured that the American fleet was not just facing a missile threat, but the full brunt of Iran's naval power. As tensions soared, it was clear that this was no ordinary provocation. It was a deliberate maneuver designed to challenge American supremacy in one of the world's most critical maritime passages. The geopolitical implications were immediate. The Strait of Hormuz, carrying 20% of the world's oil supply, is an artery that sustains much of the global economy. Any threat to secure passage through this vital waterway would have ripple effects across the globe. Oil prices spiked within hours, and global markets braced for what many feared was an imminent military escalation. Behind the scenes, military planners in Washington and Tehran were preparing for the next phase. The U.S. Navy, bolstered by additional carrier strike groups and stealth bombers repositioning into the region, was ready to respond. And with the eyes of the world fixed on the Persian Gulf, it was becoming clear that the stakes had never been higher. What had started as a single missile strike was quickly turning into a potential powder keg that could engulf the entire region in conflict. The world held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The USS Gerald R. Ford is not just another warship. It is the epitome of modern naval power. When it was commissioned in 2017, it set a new standard for the U.S. Navy, replacing its predecessor, the USS Enterprise. At a staggering 1,092 feet long and displacing over 100,000 tons, the Gerald R. Ford is the largest and most powerful aircraft carrier ever built, capable of carrying up to 90 aircraft, including cutting-edge F-35 fighter jets and bombers. This formidable vessel is powered by 2 nuclear reactors, enabling it to operate for over 20 years without needing to refuel. But its significance goes beyond its size and technology. It is a symbol of U.S. military superiority, a floating fortress that serves as both a projection of American might and a base for global operations. When the USS Gerald R. Ford entered the Strait of Hormuz on its scheduled mission in early 2026, its presence alone was a statement. The strait, which is critical to global oil shipments, has long been a point of contention between Iran and Western powers, particularly the United States. For the Iranian government, the passage of such a powerful warship through this vital choke point was seen as an act of provocation, a demonstration of American dominance over a region that Iran considers its sphere of influence. For the U.S., however, the presence of the Gerald R. Ford was simply part of its ongoing strategic presence in the Middle East, maintaining stability and deterring potential threats to the free flow of oil. The USS Gerald R. Ford was equipped with state-of-the-art radar systems and defense mechanisms that made it nearly impervious to any missile or aerial attack. Its most advanced feature is the Aegis ballistic missile defense system, capable of intercepting incoming threats with unmatched precision. In addition to the Aegis system, the ship's electromagnetic railgun, still in its early stages of operational deployment, provided an additional layer of protection, although it had never been tested in combat. On top of this, the Gerald R. Ford was outfitted with the latest stealth technology, allowing it to be undetectable by most of the world's radars. All of these factors combined to make the ship one of the most impenetrable warships in existence. But beyond its military hardware, the Gerald R. Ford has a deeper significance. It is a floating symbol of American power. Its presence in the Strait of Hormuz served as a message to Iran and the rest of the world. America is ready and willing to defend its interests, wherever they may be. As the largest and most powerful aircraft carrier, it's a vessel designed not just to carry out military operations, but to intimidate potential adversaries. With 5,000 sailors, the ship's onboard complement includes pilots, engineers, radar operators, and command officers who are all trained to execute complex military operations at a moment's notice. When in full operation, the Gerald R. Ford can deploy its aircraft with unmatched speed and efficiency, delivering an almost instantaneous airstrike capability that no other naval asset in the world can match. Despite its immense power, the Gerald R. Ford has a critical weakness: its visibility. While the ship's stealth technology is impressive, it cannot remain completely undetected, especially when operating in high-risk environments like the Strait of Hormuz. In 2026, satellite surveillance technology and reconnaissance drones operated by countries like Russia and China were able to track the carrier's every move, providing real-time information to hostile actors like Iran. This made the Gerald R. Ford vulnerable to coordinated attacks, especially from a nation like Iran, which had spent years developing advanced missile technology capable of overwhelming even the most advanced defense systems. The sheer power of the Gerald R. Ford and its ability to launch airstrikes anywhere in the world in a matter of hours make it an unparalleled asset in U.S. naval strategy. However, as the carrier sailed through the Strait of Hormuz, it became clear that its size and dominance were also what made it such a target. Iran, having developed a series of advanced anti-ship missiles and drones, understood that taking down the Gerald R. Ford would be a significant blow to the U.S. military and would shift the balance of power in the region. What was intended as a routine transit turned into a high-stakes game of brinkmanship, where the Gerald R. Ford was not only a target of Iranian missiles, but a central piece in a larger geopolitical chess game. Iran's decision to target the Gerald R. Ford with a missile was not just about the ship itself. It was a calculated attempt to disrupt U.S. military presence in the region and send a message that Iran was willing to challenge American supremacy. In doing so, the Iranian regime hoped to gain leverage in ongoing regional disputes, particularly regarding control of the Strait of Hormuz and its critical oil shipments. The attack on the Gerald R. Ford was a sign that the age of uncontested American naval dominance in the region might be coming to an end, and the balance of power could be shifting toward a more multipolar world. As the missile launched from Iranian territory flew toward the USS Gerald R. Ford, the American response was swift and decisive. The U.S. Navy's sophisticated defense systems, including the Aegis ballistic missile defense system, intercepted the missile in mere minutes. The missile exploded mid-air, shattering into pieces long before it could reach its target. On board, the crew of the Gerald R. Ford was immediately alerted to the incoming threat, and as the missile was neutralized, the atmosphere aboard the warship shifted from tense anticipation to grim realization. The attack had been thwarted, but it was clear this wasn't the end. Far from it. Iran, far from retreating, escalated the situation almost immediately. The real danger was not the missile strike itself. It was the ripple effect that followed. Once the missile was intercepted, Iran's military forces began a series of provocative and coordinated actions that turned the region into a volatile powder keg. The Iranian coastal defense network, which had been built up over the years, came to life with a frightening efficiency. Fast attack boats, small, nimble vessels designed to swarm and overwhelm larger ships, rushed from Bandar Abbas. These boats were armed with a variety of weaponry, including anti-ship missiles and torpedoes, and were part of a broader strategy to challenge the U.S. Navy's dominance in the Persian Gulf. But it wasn't just surface vessels that posed a threat. Iran's submarines, some believed to be armed with sophisticated cruise missiles, silently began to move into position beneath the waves. The Strait of Hormuz, which had always been a high-risk area due to its strategic importance, was now on the brink of full-scale military confrontation. At the same time, Iranian radar and communication systems were on high alert. The country's growing capabilities in electronic warfare, developed in secret for years, were now being used to jam American systems. In the chaos of disrupted communications, the U.S. Navy faced the possibility of more missile launches, swarming attacks by fast boats, and the danger of submerged submarines. Iran had studied the Gerald R Ford closely, analyzing its vulnerabilities, and now they were exploiting them. The strategic location of the Strait of Hormuz made it the perfect setting for such a dangerous game. Its narrow waters, where every inch matters, are the ideal environment for asymmetrical warfare, where smaller, faster forces can take on larger, more powerful ships. This is what Iran's military had been preparing for, an asymmetric response to the American military juggernaut. Meanwhile, the United States was not idle. The moment the missile was launched, U.S. forces across the region went into full combat readiness. Carrier strike groups, including the USS Nimitz and USS Abraham Lincoln, were repositioned rapidly, converging on the Strait of Hormuz. The Navy's 7th Fleet, already stationed in the region, was now operating in crisis mode, setting up a blockade around the critical maritime choke point. B-2 stealth bombers, capable of carrying out precision strikes anywhere in the world, were repositioned to bases in Qatar, ready to launch attacks if necessary. The U.S. military also initiated cyber operations, targeting Iranian military communications and radar systems, trying to disrupt their ability to coordinate further attacks. These cyber operations, while unseen by the public, played a crucial role in blinding Iranian forces to U.S. military movements. It wasn't just bombs and missiles at play. Cyber warfare had become a critical front in this escalating conflict. As the military forces converged, the global impact of the situation became impossible to ignore. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a strategic choke point for military reasons. It is the artery that carries 20% of the world's oil supply. Within hours of the missile strike and the subsequent military buildup, global oil prices began to spike. In New York, London, and Dubai, traders reacted to the news with panic, sending oil futures soaring. What had once been a routine military deployment became a full-blown crisis that threatened to destabilize global markets. In the wake of the missile attack, oil tankers in the region were ordered to alter their courses, avoiding the waters near the Strait of Hormuz for fear of further conflict. The price of oil surged to unprecedented levels, with the price per barrel reaching over $200 in just a few days. Economies around the world began to feel the effects, and international pressure on both the U.S. and Iran mounted to find a peaceful resolution. Despite the growing pressure from global markets, the U.S. and Iran continued their standoff, with both sides bolstering their military positions. The tension in the air was palpable, as diplomats scrambled to mediate talks behind the scenes. However, the real question on everyone's mind was, how far would this escalation go? Would the missile strike, although intercepted, be seen as an act of war? Or was it merely the beginning of a larger, more dangerous conflict? Iran had sent a message that it was not afraid to challenge American naval power, and the response from the U.S. was unmistakable. It was prepared to protect its interests in the region, no matter the cost. The danger now was not just military, it was strategic. The U.S. had long used its naval supremacy to maintain peace and order in the region. Iran's challenge to that supremacy had disrupted the fragile balance of power. The arrival of additional American forces, including fighter jets, drones, and more warships, signaled to Iran that the U.S. was not willing to back down. However, the confrontation between the two powers now had global implications. Any further escalation could potentially draw in other regional powers, and the risk of a full-blown war in the Middle East became more real by the hour. Both sides seemed to be locked in a game of high-stakes chicken, with each unwilling to blink first. This was a defining moment for the Middle East and for global security. As tensions in the region mounted, many feared the situation would spin out of control, dragging the world into another full-scale war. The missile attack, while thwarted, had opened a Pandora's box that neither side seemed ready to close. The world held its breath, watching as the US and Iran squared off in one of the most dangerous confrontations since the Cold War. The Strait of Hormuz, once a relatively peaceful waterway, had become a potential flashpoint, with the fate of the region, and possibly the world, hanging in the balance. In this tense standoff, the risk of miscalculation was ever present. As both sides traded blows in cyberspace, on the ground, and in the air, it was clear that the region had reached a new threshold. The consequences of this confrontation would be felt far beyond the Persian Gulf, potentially shaping the future of international relations for decades to come. What had begun as a missile launch had become something far greater, a high-stakes confrontation with the potential to alter the global order. With each passing hour, the world watched as the tension mounted, waiting to see whether this confrontation would escalate into something much more dangerous or whether diplomacy would find a way to avoid catastrophe. As tensions continued to escalate in the wake of the missile launch against the USS Gerald R. the world found itself at a precipice. The attack, though intercepted, was more than just a military strike. It was a signal that the dynamics of the Middle East were shifting rapidly. The events following the attempted strike were a series of calculated moves, each one more dangerous than the last. And the question on everyone's mind was, where does this situation go from here? The risk of further escalation was now palpable, and the region, which had already been volatile for decades, stood on the edge of something far more catastrophic. On one hand, the United States had made it clear that it would not tolerate such an act of aggression. The rapid repositioning of U.S. military assets, including additional aircraft carriers, bombers, and special operations forces, demonstrated America's willingness to respond decisively. The B-2 stealth bombers, now on standby in Qatar, were ready to launch surgical strikes at Iranian military sites if tensions continued to mount. The message was clear. Any further hostilities would be met with overwhelming force. However, this buildup also served to further provoke Iran, who viewed the U.S. military presence in the region as an affront to its sovereignty. The danger now was not just military, it was a full-blown proxy war, where each side would attempt to sway regional allies and influence the outcome from behind the scenes. Iran's response to the U.S. military buildup was to dig in even further. The country had spent years fortifying its position, developing an intricate web of alliances with militias across the region, from Iraq to Syria. In the aftermath of the missile attack, Iranian-backed groups in Iraq began mobilizing, ready to launch asymmetrical attacks against U.S. forces in the region. The risk of these militias engaging in full-scale warfare against U.S. personnel in Iraq, combined with the Iranian naval threat in the Strait of Hormuz, created a perfect storm for instability. Iranian forces, both regular and irregular, were prepared to strike anywhere, at any time, with the ultimate goal of forcing a U.S. retreat from the region. The global community watched with a mixture of disbelief and concern as this dangerous situation unfolded. World leaders and diplomats scrambled to find a solution. But as military forces on both sides prepared for further confrontation, the prospects for diplomacy seemed slim. The European Union, already burdened with its own internal crises, had little leverage to mediate between the two powers. Meanwhile, China and Russia, both of whom had significant interests in the region, quietly began to make their own moves. While not directly involved, their support for Iran, through economic ties and military cooperation, provided a backdoor for Tehran to resist international pressure. The stage was set for a larger geopolitical showdown, one that could extend far beyond the borders of Iran and the US. As the weeks passed, the danger of a full-scale regional war became more real. In the Arabian Peninsula, where the military buildup was most concentrated, the risk of miscalculation was growing by the day. With US forces patrolling the waters of the Strait of Hormuz and Iran testing the limits of American patience, the region became a tinderbox. The slightest misstep, a mistaken radar reading, an accidental exchange of fire, could have triggered a wider conflict, one that would engulf not just the US and Iran, but also involve other regional players. Saudi Arabia, already deeply involved in the region's power struggles, would likely be drawn in, as would Israel, whose intelligence agencies had been monitoring Iran's movements for years. The prospect of a broader Middle East war seemed inevitable as tensions soared. The economic consequences of the conflict were also becoming impossible to ignore. The spike in oil prices had already begun to shake the global market, but the real consequences would be felt in the coming months. With the Strait of Hormuz, responsible for 20% of the world's oil supply, now a war zone, the global economy teetered on the brink of a recession. Countries dependent on oil imports, such as China and India, began to stockpile reserves, while nations like Japan and South Korea scrambled to find alternative sources. Meanwhile, in the US, the looming threat of a prolonged conflict began to erode public support for military intervention. As American forces prepared for a prolonged engagement, both domestically and internationally, the question remained: how far would the US be willing to go to assert its dominance in the region? In the midst of this growing crisis, the situation continued to evolve in unpredictable ways. The possibility of diplomatic talks had not been entirely ruled out, but each passing day made it less likely. While both the US and Iran remained steadfast in their positions, the risk of accidental escalation, or even deliberate provocation, remained high. Military experts feared that as both sides dug in their heels, the likelihood of an unintended full-scale war increased. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies in the US were working overtime to uncover potential Iranian strategies, while Tehran's military planners were keeping a close eye on every move made by the US military. At the heart of this growing crisis stood the Strait of Hormuz, a small but immensely powerful geopolitical flashpoint that could determine the future of global stability. It was now more than just a naval standoff. It was the final test of both countries' resolve. The world waited with bated breath to see whether diplomacy would win out, or if the situation would spiral out of control, plunging the Middle East, and potentially the world, into a new era of conflict.